G'day, here's 10 things that I do to my stock YZ250 to turn it into a freestyle machine. We've already ran this bike a little bit on the track to run it in, so it's got a pipe on it, but first thing, we're gonna strip it all down and get ready to bang some new stuff into it. Let's go. The most important bit of a freestyle bike for me is suspension. Secondly is probably handlebars. I run a high bend bar, a little bit more room in the middle, so you can move around on the bike. It opens the envelope up there in the middle, and a steering stabilizer to help stiffen the steering up, so if you let go of the bars, the thing's not gonna turn in the air. So let's get this off, jam the new ones on. Let's take the triple clamp off, head nut here, 32mm to put the GPR on, and because we've rode this thing on the track and run it in, we should be able to tighten up this top collar here a bit before the new one goes on. We'll see. Normally if you've had a few hard landings, which I did, the bearing races will run themselves in. Whole thing loosens up a bit. This one off, there's a washer under here, that one stays. This is probably the incorrect tool to do this bit, but it works. See how loose that was? That's just from running a new bike in. I like to do this steering nut up just enough to stop it moving super free. So that's it there. So next up, we're throwing on the GPR post for the stabilizer. Clamps around the frame, 5 Allen key head, just goes on bang like so. And then you've got to kind of stand over the top of the bike and get this as far in the center of the frame as you can. It's just a bit of guesswork. Don't think there's any markings. No, just take a rough guess at that. Can't see it from my house. Wear an M3 to do these side little squash nuts in. If you're really particular, you could run a set of vernier calipers around the top and get it perfect, but I'm far too lazy for that. If you can see it by eye, it's normally good enough. So I tighten these two up just enough so I've still got some squash room in the front here. And then these two little grub screws down here are gonna punch some little indents into the frame. Now, stabilizer, this is what you use to stiffen up your steering. So the stabilizer sits on top here, and this is the triple clamp that holds it all. And these are always a bit of a press fit to get on. My most used thing when putting a bike together is a bit of anti-seize. I always seem to use copper, just helps on all the threads and whenever there's a tight surface to keep it all free. And these things are a really nice fit, press fit on, so you gotta talk to it a bit. Just get my favorite tool of the shop, soft hammer. Rightio, we've got the steering head nut on. We've got to leave it loose because we still need a bit of movement here in the triple clamp, so it's just loose enough to get the forks in and line the triple clamps up. Next thing, let's check these forks out. Excited. Normally for the last like 5 years, I've gone a black DLC coating on the bottom and black anodize on the top of the fork. But this year, the guys at Shock Treatment have swapped it up and we've got black DLC on the bottom, black fork leg and Kashima on the top. That looks sexy. Came up really nice. They've even polished out, if you look closely, they've polished out all the lines that's normally in the outside of a stock fork. Looks amazing. Love that color. Definitely a fan of this rather than the black. Nice and stiff too. Right, when you line these up, you want to have your stickers on the outside there, and they look sexy. When the forks go in, you want to nip the bottom triple clamp up first because we've still got to tighten that top one down to get it all snug, and then they go last. When you've got forks this sexy, it's a good idea to put a screwdriver in the back here and keep that triple clamp, take the pressure off the coating. And then I like to run my forks the whole way down as far as I can. So there's a little chamfer on the top of the fork tube. Get them the same by eye. Again, you can use calipers, but I've been doing it for that long that I wouldn't notice the difference, so by eye is good enough. Make sure you don't close the wrong eye. Before we nip these up actually, run these the whole way out, put a little bit of anti-seize on them. Some people like to use Loctite when they're doing things. Personally, I don't like Loctite because I feel like with anti-seize rather than Loctite, you end up keeping the thread lubricated so it can come out easy next time. But the most important thing is you get the correct torque on there, because if you're checking bolts that have Loctite on them, they might feel tight when they're actually loose in a situation like this. So I prefer to just Loctite everything, then you get I prefer to torque seal everything, then you get the correct tension on everything you're putting together. Normally for an 8mm thread like this, you'd run between 18 and 22 Newton meters. And for me, I kind of know where that feels. For a triple clamp bolt, I do about that much on a thread like this. Every good mechanic knows the torque in his or her elbow. And you know that by screwing in, and when you hit 20, your elbow goes click, that's it. Check they're both the same. Easy as that. This is something that you don't want to over tighten either. So sometimes you see people cranking on stuff like this. It's not designed to be that tight. Pretty sure the manual calls for 18 on these, and I normally try and do everything a couple Newton meters above what the manual says, just because I know if I do that on the whole bike seems to be a little tighter, nothing will come loose. So it's correctly lubricated. I like to go a couple Newton meters over what the manual calls, but I've been doing them this tight for the last 20 years. They haven't come loose or moved yet. Now I've got the forks tight in the lower triple clamp here. Everything's going to be running symmetrical, so we can crush this top down and get it nice and firm. Personally, I like to do my steering head up pretty firm so it's not going to slop around the place. It's just enough so if your stabilizer isn't running quite as it should, it'll just help keep the bars a little sit where you want them to sit in the air. Here's the elbow, the old torque wrench. Jam the front wheel back in. Still nice and clean and plenty of grease on it from factory, so don't need to lube that up. But if it was an older bike or not brand new, I'd definitely lube the axle up just to make sure nothing's going to stick in there, but all feels pretty good. This is valve train grease. I'm not only using it because it's the only thing I have here, but it's also sticky, so when you're putting on axles and things like that, you can get it around the whole surface to ensure that there's not going to be any dry spots on there. Rightio, everyone's got their own way to put a front wheel on. What I like to do, especially when I've got a new set of forks on a bike, is not tighten up these lug bolts here, is just tighten up the axle. And if you tighten that up, you can see where the fork wants to sit in here. I've found over the years, if you've got different bikes through manufacturing or whatever, the axle might not quite be flush in its happy spot. They might actually be sitting flexed in like that or out like that. So you just want to see where the fork sits with that axle combo, and like I've ran tie axles in the past, that the fork's happy spot might be a couple half a mil out like that. So what happens if you ran the fork slightly in the wrong spot from the its happy little home where it wants to sit, you're going to wear out all the bushes through your suspension, because every time it goes down it's constantly side loading. So being a new bike, I tighten that up and just give the wheel a move around and see where its happy spot is. And on this it's perfectly flush, so that's good. That's how it should be. So now we can loosen these off. We'll put some anti-seize on them, put it all back together with that axle flush, and tighten this side first. Axle up, reasonably firm, like just sort of enough to crush all the bearings and make sure everything's tight in there. And then we'll do this side up, and then we'll crank on it to just, I'd take a guess and say 25 Newton meters or something. Whatever the manual calls for, do that. They're smarter than me. Big believer in copper anti-seize, as you can see. When doing stuff up though, I don't like to let the ooga dooga go on the way in. Just get it to where you can finish it off with a socket or a T-bar. Otherwise you just blow your threads to pieces. Tighten him up a bit there. This side, again, about that much. Probably a little bit less than what you do on the triple clamps on the bottom here. And we do side about that much, just to make sure all the bearings, the spacer in the middle, and the forks are nice and tight. Crank this side up. You don't want to just crank one side either, you want to alternate between the two just so they're nice and even. Clamp down and then finish this off with about that much, just enough to where you just grit your teeth when you push it. And that's nice. It's only an alloy nut on here, so you don't want to go crazy because you'll strip the thing. Rightio, brake on, get him up nice and firm. A little bit of anti-seize on these bolts. I've found out over the years to be really careful not to get any anti-seize or grease on your disc or your brake pads. They're never the same once it goes on there. They're just always, you just never keep that nice feeling brake. So I'm really, a lot of attention to detail of keeping a disc and pads clean. Even if you get on there and you try and get off with brake cleaner, they're just never the same. The pads get contaminated and that's it. So I like to do this up nice and tight, especially on the YZ. I find that the brake line can slip in this bottom clamp. So I do it up nice and tight, and then I like to get a set of multi-grips or clamp and bend this bracket in just a tiny bit to ensure that line's not going to slide around. You don't want to clamp it enough where it's going to restrict oil flow, but just enough to make sure it's gripped on there nice and tight. Next up, stabilizer and handlebars. Anti-seize. Again, anti-seize the whole weld if I could. These are just a 6mm thread in these, so you just want to do it just up enough so it's going to have a bit of tension on it. Don't need to go crazy. The thing that I find when most people are working on bikes, they normally tend to over tighten everything to what needs to be done. So I'll probably go a little on the over tight side, but definitely not as crazy as some do. And next, the GPR post. I find they work well with a cable tie. The happy spot for it to sit is up about there. And you can slide that ring down, it's a press fit, but I just like to put a cable tie under it there, and that's what I've done forever, and it seems to fit nice. It won't slide up too far or too far. Can't keep going up if it rattles out of the pole. High quality pliers to chop your cable tie if you've lost your other set. Handlebars, Pro Taper, Pastrana FMX bend. I've used these bars for a long time. You can see these are slightly used because Pro Taper recently discontinued them, and I haven't made the effort to change to a new bend yet. So for now, I'm running these, but I'm gonna start riding a new bend just so I can have plenty of spares, because right now I'm robbing them from just getting some from bikes over the years. So when you've been riding the same bike for so long, it's difficult to change things. Anti-seize these guys up. When you anti-seize these ones up, anywhere where there's a moving part near it, you want to make sure that you're not going to get any anti-seize on the bars or on the clamping surface, because your bars will not grip very well. Another part I'm a big firm believer in is a billet throttle tube. Been running these Pro Taper ones forever. They seem like the best I can find out there. They've got a billet part in here instead of the standard plastic. I find with the plastic, if I'm hanging on super tight, I can actually squeeze the plastic on the bar and it won't rotate as it should. And they've also got a bearing in the end. So if you're in a freestyle run or you crash and your throttle can't hit against the end of the tube here and lock your throttle up, you've got a bearing in there. So it's way safer, way stronger, and it's definitely a part that's worth putting on. When I put these on, I like to mark about where it's gonna go. So the happy spot looks like there by the time there's room for the bearing in the end, just so you ensure that because if you push it on, it's still got to go an extra 3/4 of an inch there. I've got a mark in the alloy from where it was on the previous bike, so I know that, bang, that's on there. So you can squeeze that as tight as you want. You're not going to create friction against the bar. If you do crash and lay the bike down, it's not going to push too far on the end. Just going to roughly set our bars here. I normally set them on just whatever the 0 setting is, and then once we get it all finished off, I'll go through and fine tune the controls and move everything around a little bit to where it feels nice. And we're going to jam the throttle on. One thing I like to do with the YZs is cut this bit of rubber protective thing off that goes over the throttle, just because I like to see everything. When you're riding every day, you can see if something's coming loose, and it just makes it easier to get to, and there's just no real need for it. So I'll put that in the bin too. I haven't had it happen in some time, but the YZ's often crack through here if you did it up tight, so maybe I'm just more cautious, not to over tighten it. And a little trick when you're tightening this up, if you can grab your throttle tube here, push it on the whole way. Ours is already on because it's got a bearing in there, but it's the same principle. Plastic one too, push it on. You're gonna have a little bit of movement in here. So I like to push it the whole way on and then bring it back to the center of where that movement is. So we're back to about here. And then you're not gonna be side loading or have the inside of that throttle tube rubbing on the inside of the housing. You don't want to be breaking throttle tubes or housings when you're riding. Then I run about that much free play. I'm not super particular on it. That seems good to me. If that's too much or little, you obviously knock that back and then you can adjust that in there. But for me, that's happy days. When tightening up the levers and clutch perches and things, you don't crank on one side then the other. You want to set the gap even in the top and bottom of the perch to the clamp so you're getting the most out of it. Then you don't need to do it as tight. Another rubber bit that I like to take off just so I can be cautious of maintenance and it's not somewhere for dirt to get stuck in. I feel if you're looking at it all the time, you're more likely to check if something's loose or not working correctly. Clutch perch, I choose to run a Works Connection Elite perch. This just has I think it's got a little bit different leverage ratio in there, so it makes the clutch feel a little bit lighter, but also it's just got a nice feel. It's always in the same spot and they're super strong. So if you end up crashing a lot like me, these things last 10 times as long as your standard one. One thing about Works Connection is they make super quality parts. So every time I use them, you can ensure that they're gonna be the best there is. And one more quick one to add on the Works Connection clutch perch, they actually have a bearing that you can see in the lever here. So it's going to be nice and free. And it might not seem like, hey, you need a bearing in there, but when you're riding, you're on your clutch all the time. So every little bit that you can make 1% better, in my eyes, is worth it. And got a lock nut on the bottom here that will jam up into it. For freestyle, I like to crank on the clutch perch a bit because I use my finger to get back from some tricks. Like if you're doing a KOD, I actually put a lot of weight on here. So get nice even spacing in that gap on the top and bottom. Another thing I like about this, I'm pretty particular on how much free play I've got. So when you're on the fly, you can just get your hand when you're riding and go like this if you need to change it. And if I'm doing a front flip or something, my free play is a little not quite enough where I make sure I need to know that I'm not going to stall the bike in the air. I'll actually take all the free play out before I do a fronty. Or if I'm doing something like something's hard to flip and I want to flip with my finger on the clutch, I'll put a bit of free play in it so I don't accidentally pull the clutch in on the lip. So I definitely use that quick adjuster more than most. Kill switch, personal preference to where you like this. I like to put it underneath my throttle cable here. Some guys for freestyle like to put them down on their radiator hose because there's not enough room on their bars because they're running flip levers and stuff. I don't use flip levers, so I've got plenty of room on the bar. I'm also very conscious of being able to get to it because I've been in the foam pit before where you might land next to the bike and the throttle's jammed on and the bike's knocked itself into neutral and it's just revving off its tits in there, or the back wheel's in the air flying like crazy. And if you can't get to the kill switch, you're gonna start worrying about burning a foam pit down. So I make sure, not only for safety, but for convenience of stopping it every time, it's in a good location to get to if you need it. Right, we've got the front end all roughed in there. Next, subframe off, suspension in, and then plastics on sticker kit, and we're well on our way. Foot pegs, can't forget them. Really excited this year. I made a new seat so I can run a standard subframe for FMX, which is going to be much nicer because every time you modify a subframe, A, it takes a lot of time to do, and B, they're never quite as strong as they once were. So it's good. Hopefully the seat that we put together, which you can see in the video link below, should work. Unreal. Excited to test it. Save this for later. And bottom 17, top 14. Oh, that stock hasn't been undone, so they definitely do it stock from factory. Good thing to, if you're pulling down a new bike and doing this, or every time you pull down a new bike, whatever you're doing, you see what the factory does and try and remember what torque's on them. So they obviously light quite a lot on the shock nuts. Out with the old. The next exciting thing is checking out our new shock from Shock Treatment. Woo, sexy. Got Kashima on the housing again, black spaces, black gas canister, and a black shaft in the bottom. Do love a black shaft. Not only is it does it look cool, but the DLC coating on there is much smoother than the stock chrome, so makes seal life and makes everything move much easier. When you get A-kit suspension, Apart from having more adjustability in the shock, it's mainly just coatings, so it's definitely worth doing if you're serious about your suspension. I've seen these YZ bolts rust a little bit over the years, so a bit of anti-seize or grease on the actual shaft that goes through the collar there's not a bad idea, as well as the thread. From stock, this was pretty firm, so gonna make sure it's not going anywhere. Get this on before somehow we get some dirt in there. Over the years I've ran black, got my frames anodized black, but this year I'm just gonna leave the stock alloy. I normally get my frame and swing arm anodized black, but I'm ready for a change, and I think that the Kashima coating on the forks and shock goes well with the alloy frame. So rightio, next up, 51 tooth rear sprocket. Stock's 50, but I find 51 just gives this bike a little bit more bottom end, which is what you need, especially in 252 stroke, because there's barely any bottom end and mainly top end. So let's get this thing jammed on. So one thing that I put Loctite on is probably the sprocket bolts here. Got my little dick size 12 mil. Loosen everything off, and they're not normally tight like that. Oh, it's got the axle in there, you dickhead. If you don't like cutting your fingers on a sprocket, I often hot rod a spanner so it's a bit longer, because if you slip, it sucks. Pretty much the only part on the bike that I like to use any Loctite is the sprocket bolts, just so once they're on firm, they're not going to come loose. Even though they've got a lock nut on there, it's something that just on bikes tends to come a little bit loose. Don't like to use a high grade Loctite, just something that's that you can still get off, not one of the Loctites, the high number that welds itself on there, but just enough to give it a little something more. And I said I don't like to do things up with a impact, but I'm not feeling a little lazy. Definitely wouldn't torque them the whole way with an impact. Rightio, we'll throw that wheel back on and then give them a double check when it's on the bike. It's easier, do the correct tension. We've got an upper tooth on the rear, so we're gonna have to knock these spaces, the axle adjusting in. So I'll come this side so you can see. So I like to just hold a spanner on the nut there so it won't tighten up. And then tooth's probably about that much, a little bit more, 5 turns or something. It's much easier to do this before you put the wheel back on, because you can use a T-bar rather than trying to wedge some spanners in there. The boys over in Japan lube the axle right up for us, so I don't need to put any more grease on that. I find with a new bike with a stock Yamaha chain, you can't get a 51 tooth on there, but if you do a couple of rides on a 50 tooth, then you'll get a 51 on, and the adjuster nuts are going to be pretty much the whole way forwards. I like that because you're getting the wheelbase as short as you can, and for doing freestyle, obviously the shorter wheelbase is the better, because when you're pulling the flip you can get over the rear wheel easier. Back her off so we can move it. When I do this, if you sit over the back here and push your weight forwards, so it's pushing tight on both sides, set the numbers even, 2 over and 3 fingers, that's how you like it. And when we do him up, make sure it's the whole way forwards. Then on the tightening stroke, I like to make sure you're actually pushing the axle forwards, not trying to bring it back this way, meaning you're gonna be pushing everything as tight as it can go. Rightio, now we've got that all tightened up. I like to hold a spanner on here so you're not, when you tighten this lock nut, you're not pushing it in any direction. 2 and 2 and 3 fingers. With a YZ, if you can push your chain and not touch the back of this guide, it's normally a happy spot. Now, last thing before the plastics graphics go on, jam some foot pegs on quickly. With the YZ, you've got to get your brake off to get this pin out. There's also one of these cheeky little devils on the backside. Don't know why, because I've never had one come loose over the years, but there's probably a reason for it. I like to pro tape a peg. It's got more of a bit more grip on here, so it makes it feel good when you're standing on them all day. You want it as good as it can be. I think they're a little lighter as well. 1, 2, and we'll throw our little brake back on. I've put so many of these things together because every time I travel to a show or a contest around the world, I've got to do this before I ride when I get there. It's not only at the start of every year. When I get a new bike, it's about 5 times throughout the year, and you start to remember where every little nut and bolt is on a YZ250 just by looking at it. Done. Repeat the process on the other side and that's it. Rightio, next up, fresh set of plastics. I've used the Service forever. HRB is a Service, however you want to say it. Many ways to skin a cat. I like these because they're pretty flexible when I'm jumping in the foam pit. They don't seem to break as much as some of the other brands, so I back these guys. So I've got to trim this bit off here for the new seat because it bolts on right where this bit sits. So make sure you always wear safety squints. Plastic's hot, hot, hot. We'll pretty this up a bit. 2 words for you here, factory. While we're on the NEC's program, keep going through with everything. That much. Hardware off the old guard. Another good thing about a Service plastics is all the holes are a nice size. The plastics are a good fit. Some of the other brands you get, you've got to drill everything out before you put them on, and it's just a pain. So this makes light work of it. If you've got a good hammer, use it. Rightio, side plates. Yep, don't get angry. It's just a nut. Voila. Rightio, now before we put the seat on, we're going to throw some graphics on, and Era is a graphics company that I've used forever. Super high quality graphics. They go on with pretty little air bubbles. They seem to go on a lot better than most others. And next bit, heat gun is your best friend. Good idea to get a clean rag and a little bit of contact cleaner before you put graphics on, just to get all the shit off and any grease that might have somehow got on there. And Matty Mac taught me a trick with graphics. The more effort you put in, the more upset you are when they don't look good. So slap them on, and lucky with the Era that they're good enough quality that they go on nicely. I do pride myself in being able to do this bit pretty quickly. Start going back halfway, a bit square, pull the back straight. You can get a lot of heat into these things with your hand just by moving backwards and forwards, a bit of friction. We all know about that. And then you just want to work it down. When you get on these big surfaces, they're the hardest because there's so much, really easy to bubble these ones. So line that up, line that up. Back there. We'll leave the feather out. And we've got a tiny little bubble in there. Good thing about Era graphics, put a little bit of heat in and the bubbles push back out to the top. Perfect. Get this claw lined up, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck. Sometimes when you're trying to put graphics on, you just end up with bubble after bubble, and most of the time it's just the graphics company, the material they use, but whatever Era uses, you seem to be able to just push it on, no bubbles, and they stay on good. They never come off all year. Better quality material than some of the other manufacturers. Shroud's probably the trickiest one to get on. This is such a long piece with so many curves. But again, if you do it quick, you're not upset if it looks bad. You want to do these in, when you get a big one, just peel half off at the start. Guy there roughed out. Rightio, got him on pretty nice. Now there's a few little spots where it's not sitting down quite nice. You can see here where it's up a little bit. If you put heat onto it and push it down, you can then get rid of that and shrink it into place. And I was told a long time ago by someone that does a lot of graphics, once you heat it and get it into place, squish it into place, let it cool and then heat it again, and that'll set it in place. Don't know how much truth there is to that, but it's what I've done for a long time, and it seems to get rid of those little corner areas. So heat it in place, sitting there, sitting there, sitting there nicely, and voila, perfect. Bang, happy ending for this thing. Rightio, fork guard going on. Anywhere you've got a steel thread going into something aluminium or aluminum, make sure, big believer in anti-seize on that, just makes everything last so much longer. Okay, next up is our carbon seat. This thing's still a bit of a prototype, so let's hope it fits. Happy with the new seat, fitting on there good. It's only got, you can watch the video, click the link to see when I made this seat, but it's only got prototype foam and cover on there, so it's got to get cleaned up a little bit, but I just didn't want to go to too much effort before we did any testing, just to make sure that it's going to be what I want to stick with. So now I'm just going to cut the grab out a little bit bigger, and when I cut grab holes out, I get a bit of masking tape and just tape off where we want them to go, so you don't end up over cutting the whole show. So we want to keep that blue line there, taper that in like so. Nice little bit cut out there. Rightio, when cutting plastic out, easiest way to do it is gas torch, heat up a blade nice and hot. Like so. And then it's like a hot knife through butter. Give us a straight edge with a bit of tape. And I think that's a good size grabber. I wouldn't really want to go any more than that. Next side. Okay, that looks good. There's plenty of room there to go deeper in the grab, like the subframe's still kind of that far lower, but I want to keep the grab as small as I can just to make the bike look a little better. Hate seeing bikes with massive grab holes in the side, especially like I've had in the past. So I'm just going to test it like that first and see if that's big enough to grab. Feels good. It's held on by 4 different bolts, so it's going to be super strong as grabbing onto a subframe, more or less. So pretty excited with this new layout. It's going to make it much easier to travel, leaving the stock subframe, and much easier to get parts when you break things overseas. You can just bang new seat straight on and ready to go. Okay, now we're going to pull this off the stand, set the bars, set the levers, put some grips on, and see how she looks. So when I put grips on, I like to super glue them on so they don't move at all. Then you don't really need to wire them. Load that up with super glue before it dries, bang them on. For purposes of this video, I don't have any super glue here, so I'm gonna do that right before I ride this thing. But you gotta pretty much whack that thing off to get it on there. These Pro Taper grips are that good and thin. Sometimes I don't even put anything on there and they just seem to stick and stay on good. Voila. And that's got nothing on there and you literally can't turn them at all. Like they're solid. Cables, cable tied up nice and neatly. I get my fuel hose, cut about 8mm off the end. Run a cable tie through here. Right over that. Back down that, tighten him up like so. Because with freestyle you've got your feet going through the bars, with some tricks you want to make sure that you got all this stuff tied down nice and tightly so your feet can't hit it and accidentally pull the throttle on when you're in the air, because that would be bad. And then for my fuel line, I just grab a cable tie through here, stick him down the side, you want to make sure this cable tie's nice and loose so it can still, so it's not going to kink that hose, because if the fuel tank can't breathe, you're not going to get any fuel to your bike and it will bog. Drill a hole for this front plate where we trimmed it. Center, and one. Pull that down nice and tight there. And then do a final check of where we want our levers to sit and bars. To me, those bars are rolled a little far forwards. I like to crank on these a fair bit. They're an 8mm thread, so you're allowed to crank on them a fair bit. Pretty solid. One thing you don't want to do is pull back for a flip and have your bars move back. Had that happen, so try and avoid that one. Levers, I'd go down a little with that front brake. Again, keep an even spacing in the top and bottom gap so you get the correct tension. Rematch this throttle, push that on, pull it back in the center. Test these grabs out. Feels unreal, plenty big enough. I like how they're a little closer to the handlebars than the old style YZ grab. This means that you can get, when you're doing seat grab flips and stuff, you can get there that split second quicker. Solid as rock, Harry. Well, there we have it, the new YZ250 2024 model setup. It's gonna be a big change from last year having the seat like this, but definitely a big fan having the grab a little closer to the handlebars, meaning when you're doing like seat grab flips and stuff, you can get back there quicker. So very exciting. Next video, we're gonna run this thing in and see how she goes. It's definitely gonna be a bit of a change for me. I've ran the old style of the seat for the last 15 years, so it's gonna be exciting to change it up. Let me know what you think in the comments of the new seat, leaving the stock subframe and having like the standard ride height, and if you think I'm going down the right path. Stay tuned for when we run this bad boy in.